Welcome to EDCO's 64th Annual Virtual Conference and Showcase, Evolve On. My name is Belinda Witt-Graham, and I'm the Manager of Economic Development at the Town of Minto and an EDCO board member. I was so pleased to have had the opportunity this year to co-chair the 2021 Planning Committee with Kate Burns-Gallagher from the Western Ontario Wardens Caucus. A sincere thank you to the 2021 planning team who volunteered their time and talents to create a wonderful program. I'd like to invite you to visit the conference website for the list of these amazing people. We've also posted information on our lineup of outstanding speakers who will be joining us over the next 6 weeks. It's a new format this year, and we have some innovative topics and speakers to inspire you. Our sessions were designed to help economic developers evolve their communities and move forward in this new year. Each year, EDCO delegates look forward to getting together at various networking events during the conference. We'd like to continue this tradition by organizing a virtual happy hour. Please let us know how you feel by completing the poll that will appear on the screen. If there is sufficient interest, more information will be shared with you in the coming days. I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping details before we begin. We hope that you will actively participate in all of our sessions through the Q&A, chat, and polls today. The Q&A and chat buttons are located at the bottom of your screen. You also have the ability to upvote questions. If you like one, you want to see it answered, upvote. And you'll see a raise hand function. Ignore that. Just use Q&A to get your questions answered. Finally, if you experience technical issues, please send an email to the address shown in the chat. I'd like to now welcome our keynote sponsor, Wayne Passmore, Economic Development Specialist at Enbridge Gas. Whoa. Sorry, guys. To say a few introductory remarks and introduce our keynote speaker and moderator. Over to you, Wayne.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Belinda, thank you for that introduction. Enbridge Gas is once again pleased to sponsor the EDCO conference. At Enbridge, we like to say life takes energy. And the one thing we have all seen in this past year is that life and the energy preferences of customers and society continues to evolve. Enbridge meets over 30% of Ontario's energy needs and heats more than 3/4 of Ontario's homes. Our franchise area generates 40% of Canada's GDP, and each year we invest more than $2 billion in this province, and we pay property taxes to the cities and municipalities where we operate. We are an integral part of economic development in this province. Enbridge is partnering and investing to provide cleaner energy sources while building and maintaining a modernized infrastructure network that plans for the energy and environmental needs for future generations. Enbridge Gas is innovating to advance lower carbon natural gas solutions that can provide an immediate and affordable way to achieve meaningful carbon reductions. We are focusing our efforts in 3 areas: conservation, cleaner technologies, and green fuels. Over my 6 years at the EDCO conference, our message to the EDCO membership has been consistent. Enbridge wants to continue to work and evolve with you to support your economic development goals to attract and retain businesses across the province. Our one economic development professional I have had the privilege to work with a lot over this past year is your incoming president, Lydie Romanuk. Lydie, your persistence and advocacy in working with Enbridge on behalf of Haldimand County is second to none. I am sure that you will have a great upcoming year as EDCO president. It is my pleasure now to introduce the first session of the 2021 EDCO conference series. I am delighted that Janice Stein is with us today, and I look forward to an interesting session. Janice Stein is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was awarded the Molson Prize by the Canada Council for an outstanding contribution by a social scientist to public debate. She has received an honorary doctorate of laws from 4 universities and is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario. A well-known guest on CBC, BBC, and TVO, she analyzes the big global trends of tomorrow to help make sense of the world today. Please join me in welcoming Janice Stein. Over to you, Lydie.
Thank you, Wayne, and good morning, everyone. Just waiting for there's my video. Wayne, thank you for that great introduction and that great presentation. And good morning, Janice. EDCO is thrilled to have you join us today to share your knowledge and insight on global politics and current events that will no doubt impact our roles as economic developers in our respective communities. Recognizing that you and I have a lot we want to talk about today, I thought we'd dive right into our conversation. Is that okay with you? Oh, I think you're still on mute. I can't hear you yet.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go.
Awesome.
Great.
Are you ready to get going, Janice?
I'm ready and looking forward to our conversation and to being with EDCO members.
Thank you so much. So just before we get started, I wanted to remind the viewers to please send your questions to Janice and myself throughout the session, and you can send those right into the Q&A section, and you'll be able to upvote those questions. Heather will be monitoring the Q&A and bringing forward questions throughout the presentation. And as a reminder, don't use the chat for questions as we may not see those. So let's begin today, Janice, with talking about what's on everybody's mind. You mentioned just before we got on this morning that you saw the departure of President Trump leave the White House this morning. But later this morning, Joe Biden will be inaugurated as the President of the United States. This inauguration is taking place in the midst of the gravest political crisis the U.S. has experienced in modern times. What consequences does this have for Canada and the president's capacity to push forward with his agenda?
Lottie, that is a great question. I think everybody is mesmerized today by what is happening in Washington. It is the most jittery I have seen Washington in my lifetime. You know, we have 25,000 soldiers and National Guard deployed in Washington. The city's functionally locked down at its center. It's really stunning that this has happened in the United States. In a paradoxical way, what happened 2 weeks ago at the Capitol, I think will make it easier for President Biden to move his agenda forward. People were so shocked that there is a willingness, I think, in Congress, and we've seen this with somebody like Senator Mitch McConnell, the former majority leader who will now become the minority leader. There is, I think, a willingness to work together with the new president, Joe Biden, whose whole life experience is nonpartisan, building coalitions across the aisle. I think the president that is coming in today at noon, probably best positioned of anybody to actually move his agenda forward. That's not to say this is not without bumps, because the United States is more divided now than I've ever seen it, frankly. I think what matters a great deal to Canadians here are two big things, and then we can get into the specifics of the Biden agenda. The first is that there is reasonable political stability in the United States. The United States is our neighbor, our biggest customer, biggest trading partner. The kind of jitters that we've seen, the disruption, is a problem for us as well as for Americans. The second big thing that Joe Biden has to get done, and this may surprise some of you, he's got to bring the pandemic in the United States under control. We in Canada will still have at best only a partially open border until it happens. US economic performance is going to be depressed until that happens. They have, right now in the United States, and it's arguable, depending on the data you look at, but they are among probably the world's worst performers in managing the pandemic. So the overwhelming priority for Biden now is to roll out that vaccine in as aggressive a way as he can and bring those numbers down. The third big comment, Lydie, I think Canadians are probably not prepared for the Biden economic agenda. If I closed my eyes, just read the words, and didn't listen to who is saying them, this agenda is an America first economic agenda. It is Buy America. It is Made in America. It promises to reshore manufacturing to the United States. Canadians, businesses may have different kinds of challenges, but this is not what many Canadians are looking for: easy, open access to the US market. And it is going to pose big, big challenges for our premiers and for our federal government.
Thank you, Janice, for that great insight. So just moving on with Biden, we're already seeing some news about the cancellation or the potential cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline project. How else will Canada's trade and investment relationship with the US be impacted by the new president?
I was surprised, Lydie, that the president is apparently going to, by executive order, cancel that pipeline almost among the first things that he does. I suspect he's doing it to get it out of the way, and it does not take into account many of the changes that have been made in that pipeline, which actually would have made a contribution in many ways to cleaner energy. But that's beside the point. This president is coming to office with climate change, one of his three biggest priorities. This is what we call a signal to the marketplace, literally out of the gate. He is telling his constituents, I am delivering on what I promised. And I think he's sending a signal to the Prime Minister of our country and to the Premier of Alberta: don't spend your political capital lobbying on this one. But what it also says is his Buy America agenda. He is saying in the most explicit terms, government procurement will favor US businesses and US firms. We are going to watch on every procurement contract. And this has been a long-standing issue between Canada and the United States. But frankly, under NAFTA, especially when it was renewed over the last 3 years, it receded. No more. We are going to watch that for every government procurement contract, American firms get those contracts and provide products that are made in America. It's going to make it much harder for Canadian businesses to access what are huge amounts of money that Biden proposes to put into procurement over these next 4 years. Canadians are going to have, Canadian businesses, Canadian developers, they're going to have to be on their toes. And I think there is a big decision facing our government, and that would be true whether it was a conservative government or a liberal government. Here's one I think for the developers in the room to think about, and this is not an easy one. Our government could go to the United States and say, we need a North American strategy. Don't think about this as a made in US strategy. Think about this as a North American strategy. And if we do that, we will be more deeply integrated into the US economy. We will lose some of the sovereignty that we have, and we will now be firmly anchoring ourselves to the United States over this next decade. If we don't do that, our second option, make an exception for us, do a carve out for us. That has worked until President Trump became president. I don't think that we will do very well in the Biden administration asking for exceptions. So we are at an important point for our economy and for our future.
Thanks. I think that's a great idea to have that North American strategy. We did get a question from one of the from an audience member, and the question is, how will Biden deal with China economically?
This is a great question, Lydie. And again, this is for Canada, one of these come to truth moments. Biden has said unequivocally that he plans to build a coalition of democracies, that Chinese strategy has been deal with every democracy bilaterally. And of course, we in Canada know the challenge. We are, after all, a small country. China is a colossus. And when we deal with China on a bilateral basis, we frankly have almost no leverage with them. So Biden has said we are going to build a coalition of democracies and we're going to deal with China that way. What's the challenge? Last week, literally before Joe Biden became president, the European Union, led by Angela Merkel, signed an investment deal with China. Set the terms of investment done largely to promote German auto manufacturers, which does very well in the Chinese market. But there's a big, and Xi Jinping, who is astute, made a number of significant concessions in the last month in order to get that deal signed. Now, why would he do that? He was responding to Joe Biden before Biden becomes president, saying, oh no, it's not going to work that way. The economic interests of the European Union, and by the way, Canada and Australia, in the Chinese market are so large that if you think you're going to be able to unify democracies, you're not going to succeed. So from what I understand in the transition team right now in the Biden administration, many are advising the president, wait, don't do this for two reasons. One, the United States has to be able to credibly project an image that it is a democracy, and this last 2 weeks have been traumatic. And secondly, hard work needs to be done with Europe in order to persuade European leaders that there is an agenda for collaboration amongst Europe, Canada, Australia, the United States on intellectual property, on technology transfer, on all the issues that each country has had so much difficulty in dealing with China when we try to do it on a bilateral basis. So this is a work in progress, is all I can say to the person who asked the question.
Great question and great response. We have another question before we move on to a little bit different topic. Are U.S. customers willing to pay higher prices to support the Made in American programs? The only way to reshore industrial production cheaply is to invest in robotics and extensive automation.
That is, I think, the most important question for these next 10 years. And it's a question that we in Canada are asking ourselves too. They're actually very similar conversations going on in both countries. To bring this home for just a moment, we are having a conversation about why our government has had so much difficulty securing supplies of vaccines in the global marketplace. There has been a scramble for vaccine supply, and we do not have a manufacturing base that is robust enough in this country to manufacture vaccines for a good reason. Our market is 35 million people, and that is not a big enough market. So the Canadians pay much more in order to grow a domestic manufacturing base, or do we continue to do what we do, which is hope that our governments are nimble enough in the global marketplace? In the United States, that is exactly the conversation that's going on, but they have a market of 350 million people. So reshoring, even at higher prices, is a price that it looks like American consumers are willing to pay, and here's the condition, if they believe that the products that are reshored through domestic manufacturing are essential to their health and to their national security. So that's where we are going to see a made in America strategy. Yes, digitization and robotics can make those prices come down, but only at the cost of destroying jobs. And part of the contradiction in the Made in America strategy of the Biden administration, two messages at the same time. First message, Made in America, buy in America. Second message, grow jobs. And when you listen to Janet Yellen, the new Secretary of the Treasury, it's the emphasis on her strategy is not economic growth, it's growth in jobs. And there are strong economic and political reasons for that. There is a deep inconsistency right now in the early days of the Biden administration, and we're going to have to see how that plays out. Generally speaking, though, after 4 years of the Trump administration and America First, voters are predisposed to Made in America. There's no question. And that is a sea change for Canadians.
Thanks so much, Janice. We do have another question, and I'm trying to make sure that we answer the audience's questions, but we also have a number of questions that we want to get into. So I'll ask this one question, then we'll move on. Should Canada and Canadian companies begin expanding free trade and relationships with Commonwealth countries to blunt the America First attitude of the new administration and blunt the Chinese influence?
That is our challenge. We have been struggling to do this for the last 50 years. Those of you whose hair color is mine may remember something called the third option in the 1970s that the father of the current prime minister started. And it was that message. How can we diversify our trade? That conversation is an old one, and we've struggled to do it because the United States is just like, it is so easy for developers and exporters to engage in the US market. We speak the same language. We cross the border with so much ease. It is so tempting. And so we struggled 10, 12 years ago to diversify our trade from the United States, and we diversified to China. But our trade with China, even today, is a tiny proportion of our exports to the United States. Despite 50 years of effort, we export 75% of everything we export goes into the US market. So yes, we should try to do it, but that is going to require a nimbleness, an aggressiveness, an increase in our risk tolerance that is just, generally speaking, not characteristic of our exporters.
Janice, as we move into our next area of discussion, I thought we would engage our audience by asking for their response on the following poll. Audience, please take a moment to answer the poll that will be appearing on your screen momentarily. The question is, what is the most important economic development priority in your community for 2021? Is it business recovery or business retention? And we'll just wait for a minute while the poll, people answer the poll, and we'll see the poll results. Just waiting for those results.
I know this is what every community across this country is thinking about and struggling with right now.
So we see about 65% business recovery and 35% business retention. So yes, I agree. I know my community as well. We're very much focused on that business recovery piece right now. I assume that's going to continue for some months. So moving on, Janice, our next area of topic was we're talking about the fact that Canadian cities are facing unprecedented stress as a result of the pandemic, sort of in line with our poll that we just had. And up until the pandemic, the cities have been the engine of our innovation. Are we seeing the early signs of a rebalancing where smaller cities and communities will attract those who can work from home and want more space? And how can we spur investment in these kinds of communities?
I think thinking about our cities is one of the most important things that we have to do over these next several months. And certainly, Lottie, we are seeing that. And I think you personally are well positioned where you are as a development leader. You see this. We are seeing numbers, and the numbers are not huge, but they're real. Leave the big city, particularly Toronto, move an hour and a half away to smaller communities, largely because they are now able to work from home. And therefore, a long and tiring commute, small living space at high prices become far less attractive to them. I think there was a good news story here. And I'll come to what happens to the bigger city in a minute, but I think there was a really important good news story here that we are able to diversify economic growth, entrepreneurship, innovation outside the clusters of big cities into surrounding communities. And if we can succeed at doing that and retain in these outlying communities people who have moved, everybody will benefit from this diversification of growth. What do we need to do to make sure that people moved out of the city? And these are often people with young families. What do we need to do to keep these people in local communities? Well, there's several things. First and most important is our digital access, that we make sure that smaller communities have access to the highest grade digital services, because that is the platform on which everybody is working. And we are at the edge of the 5G revolution, which is going to roll through over the next 4 or 5 years. It's going to be critically important to distill and extend 5G into smaller communities. And you know, there's a physical challenge there. We have to put sensors into tall posts, whatever those are, a sufficient density to make sure that smaller communities have digital access. Secondly, we need great public transportation that expands beyond the perimeter of the city. Light rail transportation. So on the days people have to come into the city, they can do that. And third, we need great public services, ranging from public schools for the kids of people who moved, and great coffee shops where people can congregate and really get the advantage, which the city does not offer, of vibrant and supportive communities. So I think this is something that is really important, and developers need to take this on. As far as the big city is concerned, big cities survive almost everything in history. So people ask me, am I worried about the future of the city of Toronto? No, I'm not. And believe it or not, even during this pandemic year that we've just left behind, 2020, when we had the exodus that you talked about, Lydie, Toronto still had a small net gain in population. And let's just add one more piece to this puzzle. Canada is an immigrant receiving country. That is a key component of our future prosperity and growth. Our rate of immigration to Canada last year suppressed, something like 60,000 instead of almost 300,000. As soon as these restrictions are lifted, we will have to double our immigration rate for a year or two in order to make up for the deficit. There will be a massive inflow of people into this province, both in satellite communities And in the city, we need to get ready so that we have a success story here.
Thanks for sharing that information. So moving on, can you share your thoughts on how Canada can build resiliency in its economy so that our government does not have to chase vaccines in the global marketplace? It's something that we kind of touched on earlier, but I think we can speak to it a little bit more. It's a big news story right now with the fact that we're not getting any vaccines next week at all from Pfizer. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I'm like everybody else in the room, Lottie, I'm frustrated. I'm sure everybody is frustrated, and I know our government is frustrated. But it's a really interesting case study. If you don't have domestic manufacturing capacity, how vulnerable you are to the global marketplace. So we need to have a very serious conversation in this country about what we are willing to pay more for. We certainly have the capacity to manufacture, for example, PPE, which we really need during this pandemic. We had firms in this country turn their shop floors around and convert to manufacturing PPE last March, April, May. When the pandemic eased its grip just a little bit in the late spring and summer, some of our hospitals and clinics returned to the global market and frankly bought PPE from China at lower cost. That makes it impossible for Canadian manufacturers to develop, because if we do not guarantee our manufacturers a secure market, which means, and there's only one way to do it, through procurement, that is the only way we can do it at a higher price, we will not, in fact, become a more resilient economy. So on what issues are we willing to do this? Let me give you one other that has been in the news for the last 2 years. All of you know about it, which is our 5G networks, digital networks, 5th generation digital networks. Huawei, probably the leading global company from China, can provide that equipment at a lower cost. But we would be allowing a Chinese company into, at the very least, what we call the periphery of these digital networks. Although our government has not made a decision, our 3 biggest telecoms have now said they will buy that equipment from Samsung, Ericsson, Nokia at a higher price. There's an example where we've made a decision to pay more in order to buy greater security for our next generation digital networks. This is a decision we're going to have to make over and over. What's my prediction? On areas that Canadians feel is critical to our health and to our national security, there will probably be a willingness to pay more, just as there is in the United States. So we're moving, and here's, I guess, the big picture message for everybody in the room. We are moving into markets over these next 5 years where governments will play a much bigger role than they have in the last 25 years. That's, I think, the big picture story.
I think that's encouraging to hear, because so often the government procurement policies are all based on lowest cost. So right. I think it's definitely a big switch to start thinking about quality over cost, and it'll be interesting to see how that progresses. I see that there are a few questions in our Q&A. I'm going to leave those to the end. We're going to, just to let the audience know, we're probably going to stop talking around 9:50 or so, just to allow for questions. So if you have some more questions, audience, feel free to put those in at any time, and we will bring those forward at 9:50. So, Janice, as we were preparing a couple of weeks ago for today's conversation, we discussed how many current political leaders at all levels have a fear of making mistakes because they just can't risk being the front page news tomorrow. So with that in mind, how can we grow the appetite for risk-taking among our public investors while still insisting on public accountability?
Yeah, that is, Lydie, as you know, one of the issues that I worry about most in this country and that I feel most strongly about. As we are in the middle of serious disruption in our economies. We are in the middle of a transition to fully digitized economies that is going on, or will probably take the next 15 to 25 years. And when you're in a period of disruption, we call this the fourth industrial revolution. Doesn't matter what label we put on it. I think every one of us has seen over this last 10 months this sense of where we're going, how our work life has changed, what we are able to do with digital technology that we thought we never could do. We've had to move fast forward. In that kind of environment, countries and societies that do well are those that are nimble, able to adapt, and able to innovate. But all those things require a higher tolerance for error, because you don't adapt and you don't innovate if you don't allow yourself the possibility that you're going to get something wrong. You're going to learn quickly, you're going to adapt, and you're going to move forward and try again. If I think about our public investors, our large pension funds, if I think about our leading public officials, people who are really deeply committed to service to this country, there is nevertheless a fear that if they make a mistake, they will be pilloried by the public. Careers could be destroyed, frankly, if somebody makes a mistake and they find themselves on the front page of the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail. A career of service can be destroyed by somebody who makes a poor investment in long-term development, somebody who makes the wrong decision with respect to procurement of decisions or authorizing a screen or a test. It doesn't matter. There is almost a pathological fear now of making an error. I think we need our institutions across society to speak up now. Of course, we hold public officials accountable at all levels, and we hold our investors accountable. But we hold our officials and our investors accountable for ethical behavior, for following the rules in an appropriate way. We should not, however, continue to do what we do, which is when an investment for which there were reasonable grounds to make it doesn't succeed, or when an official tries something new and it doesn't work, we cannot continue to have almost, frankly, and I'm going to use these words, a mob mentality that pillories our leaders and largely in the public sector, and is absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. If we continue with this culture in Canada, we will become more conservative, small key, C conservative, more afraid to make an error, less innovative, less adaptive. I was talking to somebody the other day, Lydie, and I said, we need a prize. We need to give a prize every year for the public official who tried something really interesting and it didn't work, but reward that person's initiative and courage and entrepreneurship and innovativeness, because that's what we want from our public servants. You think that's a good idea?
I think that's a fantastic idea. I mean, I see our public, become more and more critical about politicians. You see it, on the various social media channels, and
yeah.
It's very difficult to be that risk taker in the, think that you might receive some negative comments or destroy your career, etc. Even though your goal is focused on improving, the public and supporting the public. So I think that's a great idea to encourage that innovativeness and that risk taker. I think most of us as economic developers are those type of people. And so I think many of the audience would support that too.
I'm going to come back to you on that.
Okay. I did see a question. It says, Canada has had a cheap food policy for many years that forces farmers to compete with imports and has created food insecurity. Meanwhile, smaller communities charge low farm property tax to sustain the cheap food model. How will food prices change, and will consumers be willing to accept increases?
That is a very, very important question. Let me put the big picture frame on it before I answer it specifically. The big picture frame is that I and many others think that Canada can become a leading agro-food innovator. We have the resources, and with a strategy and appropriate investments, we can become one of the most important players in the agro-food market. The questioner is, I think, is putting her or his finger on exactly the right issue. We import cheap foodstuffs, number one. And number two, we also import a lot of food because all of us have gotten used to eating raspberries in January. That is not, there is nothing we can do about the kind of indulgent tastes that we've all acquired over the years. So we're always going to import some. But again, the big question for Canadians, are we willing to pay more for homegrown food that is a higher quality? What's the encouraging news here? And I think many developers are seeing this right now in their local communities. There's a buy local movement, right? Which means, and especially if you move outside the big city, but just outside the big city, we want our local farmers to succeed. We want farm to table products that don't go through a long transportation network. And you're seeing, as part of the revival of communities, part of make sure that our communities recover, which is engendered by the pandemic. Part of that is focusing on food, which is locally produced and locally sourced. I think that will grow, but it needs leadership from developers who make the point that just as much as schools and businesses and easily accessible banking are part of our communities, local food is an important part of who we are, and we want to provide every opportunity for consumers to have access to that food. We're seeing a big change here.
Janice, I thought we'd put up a second poll question for the audience. And maybe while I'm putting up the poll and we're waiting for answers, you can speak a little bit to this conversation. Something we touched on a couple weeks ago. It was the fact that there's probably a lot of extra cash sitting around right now in people's bank accounts. But yet on the public side, the government side, they're going to be very cash strapped and very much in debt for the next few years. So, is there an opportunity to encourage people to invest in public infrastructure? But what my question to the audience is sort of along the same lines. If you had personal savings to invest in public infrastructure, what sector would you invest in? Would it be tourism and hospitality, infrastructure, including hard and digital, housing, or culture and recreation? And Janice, I'll pass it over to you while we wait for the responses.
Really good question, Lydie. We're seeing two patterns that are literally crossing each other. We have had the highest rate of domestic savings in Canada in this last year that we've had in 20 years. It's astonishing how high the level of household savings has gone up. Here's the caveat: for those people who have kept their jobs and been able to work at home. We have, we talked about the indebtedness of Canadian households. A year ago, the Bank of Canada was worried about that. That worry is now gone because of the high level of domestic savings. At the same time, as everyone in this room knows only too well, our government has spent on income support and small business support in the wake of the pandemic, and our government debt and borrowing is through the roof. We will probably have to do that one more time in the next federal budget. And yes, interest rates are low, but we cannot continue to do this forever. At some point, we're going to have to pivot. to two things: to strategic investments in the economy for the next generation, and to some sort of debt repayment schedule with a fiscal anchor. And we'll probably see that fiscal anchor coming in this next budget. But we have now huge pools of private capital that are uninvested. Again, in a more entrepreneurial, more nimble society, how do we encourage people with large amounts of cash in their bank accounts that they do not need, even for their rainy day fund of the next year or two, to invest in communities? And what sectors do we think will offer the most productive investments? I'm watching your poll, Lottie, and we're getting an overwhelming support for investment in infrastructure. And I would say digital infrastructure is probably, for me, the highest priority for investment, especially outside the big cities, to smaller communities, to rural areas. Digital infrastructure is going to be the platform for prosperity and growth over these next several years. Every single business in this country. I said this to a CEO 5 years ago, and he looked at me as if I must have been high in some way or other. He really did. I said to him, your company is a digital company. You just don't know that yet. And I was right. Every single business in this country, will be a digital business in the next few years. If it isn't, it is imperative that we make sure that everybody has access to digital infrastructure, digital education, digital literacy. What are we doing to reach out to kids who, for example, have been out of school on and off for the last year in online courses, but with lousy digital access, because they don't have good Wi-Fi at home, laptops that work or don't work? That digital divide in our society is going to be one of the biggest issues. What are we doing to educate our next generation of young people to make them digitally literate at the same time as they learn all the other skills that they're going to need to navigate in our economy? So if I were doing this, I would say public sector, private sector, community sector, developers, let's grow the digital infrastructure and the digital literacy of our communities, because that is the pathway to prosperity for the future.
Yeah, I just can't imagine as it being in a rural area. I'm lucky I live in an urban area, but it being in a rural area, being expected to work from home, as well as having children working at school and being online as well, and how you manage that in a rural internet setting, it just doesn't work.
It's been a nightmare. It's been a nightmare, Lottie, for many communities, and rural communities especially. We're not talking about it. But one other one that we might want to put on the table for a moment: what new models of childcare? Because if we look at these last 10 months, frankly, the burden is very unequally distributed. It's women, mothers who are being asked to manage their work responsibilities and their childcare responsibilities and online education for their kids all at once. That's frankly not sustainable. So we have to think too about childcare, and we have to think about it in rural areas as well as urban areas.
Janice, we've had such a great conversation. This time has flown by. I can't believe it's already 10 to 10, and I know you have an appointment.
No, I'm good. Don't. I
Okay.
will be late for my next meeting. Don't worry about that.
Well, we can't run too much over time because Cindy will she'll have my neck. But I do have a number of questions. So I thought we'd start with the questions and answer some of the audience's questions. So I'm going to go backwards to forwards just because it's a little bit easier for me to do that. So what could we do to convince real estate agents to lower the cost of housing and rent across Canada? That kind of ties in with the affordable housing we talked about and had hoped to talk about today.
It's not the agents though; it's the developers, right? And it's the taxation policy. that municipalities impose and its developers. I think we're on the verge of a sea change here, which is really interesting. I just spent a chunk of time yesterday with a group of developers who are thinking about what, and here's a really interesting one, right? What shopping malls of the future will look like. Is retail coming back to shopping malls? So much public real estate is now shopping malls that is focused on retail, and they were actively involved with developers and municipalities in reimagining those spaces. Are there going to be, for example, a mix of affordable housing and high-end housing that gets placed around the edges of these, along with parks, community centers, schools? I think we are about to see a real transformation, an unleashing of creative energy. Again, we need to speak up. We need to say, this is what we want. You know, one cautionary note here that I love to put on the table for the people in this room, there was a lot of talk about 15-minute cities. And we all understand why, because they're walkable, because you get all your services, because you reduce the pressure on the environment, you reduce the need for public transportation. One big flashing red light here, we have to be careful that they do not devolve into communities in which like-minded people cluster. Others are excluded. They are not diverse. If that's where this ends up, we will have very big problems in this country.
The next question, Janice, is by 2050, Canadians and worldwide will be eating plant-based food because we won't have enough meat, poultry, and fish to feed the entire world. What is Canada doing to move into the plant-based food sector?
You know, I let me just say that I don't think we will have an entirely plant-based diet, unfortunately, because there are such large industries involved in meat production, even in Canada, and they are simply not going to go away. But the transition you're talking about is underway. And if you look at the data already, meat consumption is dropping every year for health reasons, for environmental reasons. And so what you're speaking about is already underway. What are we doing in Canada? Pulses are our most important agricultural export. Not pork, not beef, but pulses. And again, the marketplace is speaking here. As the market for these kinds of plant-based agricultural export grows globally, and it will, we will see Canadian farmers converting and responding, because that's where the economic opportunity really is.
That's a great idea. Thank you. The next question is, given vaccine development and doses being given, what do you see as the next big challenge facing Canada and Canadians following COVID-19?
You know, your question is optimistic because it says we've gotten through the vaccine rollout and the distribution. And that I cannot emphasize enough how complex this is, right? And so let me tie my answer to look at which countries have done better at vaccine rollout, not at vaccine manufacturing, but a vaccine rollout. You're not going to be surprised when I say countries with integrated, digitized health record systems. Because just think about this for a moment. What do you need to do to get a patient through this vaccine rollout? You need to know where they are. You need to send a message to them to book an appointment. They need to accept. When they come, you need to have a record that they took their shot. You need to put them in the calendar, hopefully, for 3 weeks later. I hope they're not delayed. They need to come back. You need to have a record, and then you need a follow-up to trace what their response is to the vaccines. That's the complete portfolio of what you need. If you don't have systems that can track that, and systems that can talk to each other, it becomes enormously difficult. Let me put the starkest possible description of our health system on the table. We have siloed systems. Sometimes they're all siloed by province, first of all. So Lottie, if you decide to go to British Columbia at some point, that system cannot speak to the Ontario system, right? But even within provinces, we have regional health authorities with siloed systems. Part of the reason that our vaccine rollout will be slower than other countries, we do not have meaningful digitized systems in which the parts speak to each other. Frankly, this is not rocket science. It's just ingrained habit. It is because health is a matter of provincial jurisdiction. But if we are going to move into the 21st century and do far better in healthcare management, in healthcare outcomes, and in healthcare innovation, we need data that comes from the country as a whole. We don't have it. And I personally, I'm just, having worked hard on a project which required that kind of data, I am, and frankly, in a state of repressed fury. We have to do something about this.
Well, you got to get that fury out, Janice. The next question is, how long will the Biden honeymoon last, and what are the potential causes of this bubble cracking?
Oh boy. Biden is taking office, and we don't have good numbers, but we have millions of people in the United States who believe this election is stolen. They do not believe that Biden won the election fairly. Now, let me say, I'm sure I don't need to say it. Let me say there's no truth to that. That claim was tested in court some 60 times, and judges appointed by President Trump threw it out. But that's not the point. Biden is working in an environment unlike any other president in the modern history of the United States. I don't think there's going to be a honeymoon. I think we have millions of people who are waiting for a mistake, or waiting for an excuse. It will not happen today in what is a fortified Washington. And some of the people who believe that election is stolen, once President Trump is gone, and he did leave Washington this morning, the steam will go out of it. But there is a real problem here, which is amplified by social media. People believe that this president, millions of people believe this president stole the White House. And that is not a recipe for a honeymoon at all, frankly. So he faces an unprecedented challenge. I think this is going to be very, very hard for him.
So right down to business is what you're saying.
Yeah,
out of the gate.
Very fast, very fast.
So we only have 1 minute left. So there was a quick question maybe that we could just touch on maybe really briefly. As part of that discussion around people leaving the cities, we're seeing real estate prices surge across parts of the province and inventory plummet. Lack of housing is making it hard for small town companies who need to have work happen in person to attract talent and grow, as workers cannot live there. How can we build that housing supply across those high demand parts of Ontario so our communities who contract workers I can't see the rest of the question. So let's just leave it there and you can put in your two thoughts.
Oh, if I only have a minute, make sure that I don't go for longer than Lottie, but
okay.
But housing is a big part of how we retain and attract really great people to our communities, to our province, and to our country. We're going to have, again, in communities outside the city, we're probably going to have a little more dense housing than we've had in the past. It may just be that not everybody gets to own a single family house because it's just too expensive. And we build new kinds of housing, even outside the city, which we have not really done, in which we lower the price because we create shared access to green space, and we share the cost of the building in ways that we have been able to do in the city, which reduces the price of housing. That's going to become a challenge in the suburbs and in rural communities. People are leaving for more space, but there probably over time is a ceiling on how much space we're going to give to any individual family in a time where the environment is fragile, where the cost of building new public transportation is high, and where we absolutely have to make housing more affordable if we're going to attract and retain the kind of skilled worker over this next decade that is critical to the future of this country and to our children's future.
Janice, thank you so much for your conversation today. It's flown by. I think we've touched a lot of topics, and I'm sure we could talk for another couple hours, but really appreciate your time this morning, and I'm sure the audience appreciates all that you've shared with us, and thank you so much. I'm going to pass the...
Just before you do, let me just say a thank you to you, Leidy. What a fun and engaging partner in conversation you have been, and congratulations. There is another inauguration happening today, not only Joe Biden's.
Thank you so much, Janice. I'm going to pass it back to Wayne Passmore from Enbridge Gas to thank Janice.
Super. Thanks, Leidy. And thank you, Janice. I really enjoyed that. That was very enlightening, and certainly a lot of things on people's mind today. I especially like the idea of EDCO contemplating rewarding political innovation with some sort of award. I think that is entirely within the scope of attainment within this organization, and that would be very consistent with our values. Anyways, thank you so much, and Leidy and Janice, thank you so much again, and we'll turn it back over to I think Cindy. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Bye for now.
As a natural gas company, a question we get asked a lot is, what are you doing about climate change? The answer? We're stepping up. We're targeting net zero emissions in our operations. We're innovating, delivering clean energy solutions for Ontario, leading the way to a balanced, low-carbon future. Natural gas meets 30% of Ontario's energy needs, including 75% of homes that rely on it for heat and hot water. You may have heard replacing natural gas is a path to net zero, but right now, electricity meets only 19% of Ontario's energy needs. To replace natural gas, the electric system would need to triple in size and would come at a cost of billions of dollars to Ontarians. Cost aside, Ontario can't achieve a clean energy future with electricity alone. Natural gas enables renewable power, fuels critical industries, and makes Ontario more resilient. It's a balanced energy choice that has a role to play in shifting Ontario to a low-carbon economy. We're investing in solutions to green the gas supply, turning food scraps, farm waste, and even wastewater into carbon-neutral, 100% renewable natural gas. RNG feeds into the existing natural gas system to green the fuel supply and reduce emissions. And we're producing hydrogen from surplus electricity, creating emission-free fuel to blend into the natural gas system. We're also helping municipalities and trucking companies switch fleets from diesel to compressed natural gas, a market-ready, low-carbon alternative for greening transportation. We're working with partners large and small. And the greenest energy is the energy we don't use. We have a long history of helping homes and businesses with conservation programs that have saved more than 56 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. We're committed to getting to net zero and helping Ontario get there too. Join us in supporting Ontario's sustainable energy future. Learn more at enbridgegas.com/environment.